I'm Scott Prater. I'm a digital library analyst at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And today I'm just going to run through a brief overview of using Migration-Utils to migrate from Fedora 3 to Fedora 6. I'm not going to run a demo, but rather just kind of talk through the steps. And there's an online video I made about a month ago, which I actually do run through in a live demo. So part of what started Migration-Utils up is back about a year or two ago, I want to say maybe 2 years ago, Lyrasis did a grant-funded project to find out what were the barriers to upgrading Fedora, and 80% of the respondents said that they were on Fedora 3 and they didn't see a clear migration path to later versions of Fedora. So early on, it was decided that let's create a migrations utility to make that possible. And that was one of the earliest things that was created as part of the Fedora 6 project. And it's under constant development. There are people who are using it and testing it out, and works pretty well. So I'm just going to walk through how to use that. Okay, so the principles, basic principles, are that Fedora 3 and Fedora 6 both run on files on top of disk. In fact, that was one of the requirements for Fedora 6. Makes it really easy to preserve, really easy to rebuild your repository. And so the migration utility looks at the Fedora files that are on the disk. It's not going through the REST API. It's just looking at files. And so the source data will be the legacy or Kuba file system on Fedora 3, or exported data. You can also export data and turn that. And then the target is going to be a OCFL repository, Oxford Common File Layout. That's just basically, as we saw in the previous presentations, it's just a structure and some metadata about files on disk. So we're basically transferring files on disk from one point on the disk drive to another point. Both Fedora 3 and Fedora 6 have objects as the base unit, and an object is simply file or files that consist of bit streams, images, PDFs, your thing, and then metadata files about it. And Fedora 3 has some metadata files like relsx, relsint, with others, and just some metadata about the data streams themselves. That go along with that. Fedora 6 also puts some metadata in OCFL for the Fedora 6 repository. Part of the migration process is making sure that the metadata is transferred over and that Fedora 6 has all the new fresh metadata it needs. Fedora 3, we have the idea of a data stream with an object. In Fedora 6, an object contains resources, but they map around pretty closely. And so migration is basically copying Fedora 3 and objects and data streams to OCFL Fedora 6 objects, and converting those as needed from the Fedora 3 format on the disk to the OCFL. Okay. Now, as part of the migration, you can just migrate from Fedora 3 to a plain OCFL repository. If you decide you want that OCFL repository to be Fedora 6 ready, you can, that's part of the migration utility, and it will also be Fedora 6 metadata files. So what's not migrated are disseminators. There's no idea of a disseminator in Fedora 6. Redirect and external data stream content are not migrated, which makes sense, but the URLs will be. Your Solar index isn't going to be migrated. Your resource index won't be migrated. And any XACML policies. I'm not sure if there are many people out there in the world who are using XACML, but Fedora had built in using the policy data stream ways to authorize access or restrict access to objects and data streams. The policy data stream will be migrated, but it won't be actionable in Fedora 6. So to prepare for the migration, you need to do a few things. First, you need to know what kind of Fedora 3 files are you migrating. Are you doing legacy, Akuba, or exported? And then you're going to set that up when you set up your export. And then you need to know where your object and data stream directories are located. And you can find this in the config files. For the legacy, it'll be defined in the Fedora config file. And for Akuba, it'll be in the Akuba LL store file. You need to know how much disk space your Fedora 3 repository takes up. That's going to be your objects and your data streams directories. The OCFL repository will be roughly the same size. I've done several tests, others have, and we haven't seen a lot of difference between the sizes of the two. And then finally, it's a good idea to know how many objects you're migrating, because you can use that then to do a spot check of how well your migration. And it'll also be good to tell, you can do some estimates based on a sample run of how long it's going to take you to do the migration. And then once you kind of have the data, you'll want to decide if you're going to be doing a partial or full migration. The migration utilities has hooks to let you start and stop the migration and to let you do the migration in batches. So you can migrate it all in one go, or you can do it in pieces. And then the migration utility will give you the option to either pass over things that have errored, or first time you get an error, stop. And so you can decide how you want to do your migration, addressing errors as they occur, or addressing them after you do the first pass. And then finally, do you plan on running several test migrations or several migrations before doing your big one? Or are you going to do that on separate hosts and then on another host do your one big migration? So once you've kind of answered those questions, you want to download and install Migration-Utils. And right now it's available on GitHub. In order to build it, you'll need and run it, you'll need Java 11, and you'll need Maven 3.1 or more in order to build it. You're going to need to install Migration-Utils on the same host, a single host, and you're going to need access to your Fedora 3 data on the file system. And you'll also need access to the file system or the disk where your OCFL repository is created. Again, all it's doing is basically copying files, transforming them a little bit from one location to another. And here are some instructions on downloading and building it. These are all on the GitLab repo. You can go ahead, or GitHub repo, you can go ahead and see how to build it. And then your executable jar file will be the target. So I'll cover some flags that you can use with Migration-Utils. There are actually quite a few of them. I want to say maybe 15 or 16 of them. They're all for different scenarios of migrating. Here are some of the more common ones you might see. The help flag, or if you run it with no flags, you'll get the help documentation, which is basically just a command page of all the flags. They're required. You'll need your source type, whether it's Akuba, legacy, or exported. And then depending on your source type, if it's legacy or Akuba, you'll also need to pass along your data streams directory and objects. That's your Fedora source data. The target directory, where you're going to be creating the OCFL repo. The working directory, where temporary data is being kept for the migration. And that doesn't need to be very big. I migrated some 10 million objects a few months ago, and my working directory and index, I think, was maybe 200 megabytes. So it gets somewhat large, but it's not, you don't need to allocate a particularly large amount of that. And then there are several flags like limit, resume, PID file that allows you to stop and start a migration or to do just a partial migration. Continue on error, as I mentioned before, by default, it'll stop at the first error it hits. But if you continue on error, it'll simply log by error and move on to the next object. No checksum validation. By default, it'll check to see if the target file or data stream matches the same one that's in Fedora 3. That can take a lot of time, and so we'll give you the option to turn that off. And then finally, debug. If you do debug logging, you get a lot more information. So before you do this, shut down or make your Fedora 3 repository read-only first. That's just simply because you're going to be copying files over. You want your Fedora 3 repository to be in a stable state and not changing out from under you as you're trying to migrate it. And then here's a simple command line where I'm just running the jar and I'm saying that the migration type is going to OCFL and being made ready for Fedora 6. My source is in the Kuba file system. Here's where my data streams are at. Here's where my objects are at. I have my target directory, which will be the OCFL repo, and the repo will actually go in the subdirectory under there /data/root. The working directory will write some temporary files and the data stream index, and then continue on error true. And then finally, this all reports to standard out. I'm redirecting it to a log so that I can see after the migration is done what warning and errors I had and work on it. So here's some of the simple output when you do a run. You can see that the first thing it does is build an index of all the data streams. So before it writes a single byte to disk, it's just going to build this index. If you have millions of objects, that will take a while. I think when I had 10 million objects, it was taking on my host close to half a day to do that. And then once the index is built, it'll start actually migrating objects. It'll do a processing log for every single object that's migrated. And basically, if you just have processing with nothing else, it means that as far as Migration-Utils is concerned, it went well, that there were no problems. Sometimes you'll get warnings like this missing invalid digest. I have checksums turned on, but these Fedora 3 objects did not have checksums reported. So it's simply logging a warning that tried to check checksum, couldn't find out a Fedora 3 object, sorry. So here's some tips on running migration. First, don't run the migration twice over the same OCFL repository. That it's not idempotent. You try to run the same one over again, you're going to get a bunch of errors. So if you want to run it again, move the old OCFL repo out of the way. If you add or change data streams or objects between runs, you need to update your data stream index. That's because the migration utility by default will look for an index, and if it already exists, it will use that. And that index will have the information about the data streams that's used for migration at the time that the index was created. So if you're going to be doing a migration, looking at errors, fixing those errors, perhaps deleting objects or adding new objects, you'll want to delete your index before running it again. And then finally, for very large migrations, you'll need enough inodes allocated on your system for the OCFL files. A lot of files are generated. If you have 1 million objects, you might easily have, depending on number of versions, 10 million files more. And systems can run into problems with that. So you want to make sure that your system is ready to manage that number of files. And then I suggest you run the migration on the screen or tmux, because basically you run it, and then it's logging to the log, and you walk away. And it could take a while. I was doing one of the 10 million objects with lots of really big things in it. It took me close to 20 days on my system. And so I just ran it in screen, and then, of course, I didn't reboot my host. And then finally, if you want to do it in batches, if you do have a very large repository, rather than running it all at once, you probably want to just break it up into chunks. And you can use the fidlist parameter to say, migrate these bits. And then you can run again, now migrate these bits. So a sample workflow that you can run through is first just do 500 or 1,000 objects or so first using Fedora. And that'll give you an idea of how long it takes, how much disk space it's going to occupy, and it'll give you some data that you can use to estimate how big your OCFL repository will be and how long it will take to create. And once you do the full migration, basically shut down your Fedora 3 repository or put in offline mode, create a list of PIDs or batches of PIDs in the PID list file, and then run it with continue on error, and look for errors in the log file. Basically, you can even just do a grep of the word warn or error in the log file. What do you see? That's what you need to look at. Then delete the data stream index and rerun the migration utility using a PID file that has perhaps collected PIDs. And then just kind of lather, rinse, repeat until everything's done. And then you can go on to the next batch. So once you've migrated, you'll want to verify your object counts. And you can do that by looking at the number of processing lines in your log file, basically everything that says processing is done. And you can also count the number of OCFL objects in your repository. And you can use the find command to do that. Every object has a file in its top level directory called 0 equals OCFL object 1.0. Do a count of that number of files, and you know how many OCFL objects you have. And then another thing you can do is you can do spot checks. You can run Fedora 6 over the top of your new OCFL root, and there's the command line there to run that. And then I'm running the one-click one. And then just look at your Fedora 3 object and look at your Fedora 6 object and just see by last modified object status the same. And you can do that for each one of the data streams also. Now, that's a lot of work, and you're not going to be doing that for all your objects. So Danny and the team are working on a validation tool right now to create Fedora 3 to Fedora 6 migration validation tool. We'll go ahead and check object by object, data stream by data stream, metadata by metadata element, whether your objects are in open shape or not. And that's still a work in progress, but it's making good progress, and that should be ready for general release soon. And that's my presentation. There's several useful links here. Basically, everything I covered is available on the tips for migrating Fedora 6 or on the Migration-Utils webpage. I also have a video demo that you can watch. And we have some data of what I and others compiled of how much time sample migrations have taken. And then finally, if you have any problems at all doing the migration, you can reach out on the email list or in the tech channel on our Slack project. Thanks.